Hello, America. I'm Mark Levin. This is Life, Liberty, and Levin. We have a great guest, Lin Wood. How are you, sir?
I'm good, Mark. Thanks for having me on.
Well, thanks for coming. You don't do a lot of interviews, do you?
I do not.
Well, it's a pleasure to have you. You're Nicholas Sandmann's lawyer.
Yes.
You've brought a lawsuit against the Washington Post, which we'll get into in great detail. You're like the go-to guy when it comes to cases like this, and this is a unique case. But I mean, where you take up the case of the underdog. Richard Jewell is a perfect example. Name some of the clients you've had in the past.
Well, Richard was my first client that got me involved in the First Amendment area in 1996 with the Centennial Olympic Park bombing. Since Richard, I've had occasion to represent some very interesting and wonderful, delightful people. John and Patsy Ramsey and their son, Burke Ramsey. I've represented the family for over 20 years. I've represented Beth Holloway, Natalie Holloway's mom, for over 10 years. Represented former Congressman Gary Condit for a number of years. Represented Herman Cain. Represented the young girl that was involved in the Kobe Bryant case. And then more recently, I've represented Vernon Unsworth, who was falsely accused of being a pedophile by Elon Musk. Vernon Unsworth was probably the hero of the saving the 13 boys in the Thai cave disaster. So I've had a variety of clients. I've gotten to know some of them very well. Richard was my first in this area. He died 11 years after the false accusations. I think the stress of those accusations contributed to his death. And I miss him every day, and he changed my life and changed my career.
Let's talk about this freedom of the press issue. Do you stand for freedom of the press, or do the people you sue stand for freedom of the press?
Well, I will say you unequivocally, I am a believer in the First Amendment. But I believe the First Amendment has no strength and real value if there is not accountability for wrongdoing. So when people on the other side say that Lin Wood's trying to chill speech, I'm trying to seek redress for false attacks. False speech has no value. And in Nicholas Sandmann's case, you're talking about false speech that threatened, attacked, and vilified a minor child. If I am accused of chilling that kind of speech, I'm happy to take that banner and wave it proudly. We don't need that speech. That's not what the First Amendment is all about.
And that's a good point. The First Amendment. We hear people throw around the First Amendment, freedom of the press. We particularly hear reporters use it. When our Constitution was established, freedom of the press basically meant the federal government hands off. But there was still power in the states where people could still bring defamation suits, correct?
Correct. Defamation law, the ability to, in effect, sue someone for false attacks on your reputation, was governed exclusively by state law until 1964. In 1964, in New York Times versus Sullivan, the Supreme Court brought in the First Amendment in cases involving public officials. And in those cases, actual malice standard of the First Amendment applied, but in the remainder of the cases, you still were governed by state law. And state law generally allows you to recover if the reporting is false and was negligent. Now, under the New York Times standard, a public official had to prove that you actually knew it was false, subjective, or that you acted with a reckless disregard for the truth. That got expanded by some very bright media lawyers into public figures, people of general notoriety, a few years later. And then it went so far, Mark, that they applied it in Rosenblum versus Metro Media to anyone who was involved in a matter of public interest. And the Supreme Court shortly after that realized they had gone too far. They dialed that back and reversed Rosenblum and said that it was only applying to a private figure if that person had voluntarily injected himself or herself into the forefront or vortex of a public controversy in an effort to influence the outcome of the controversy. I'm not sure where the actual malice standard came from on public officials in terms of how its roots in First Amendment. I think Justice Thomas has recently himself commented in a concurring opinion that he questions the constitutional validity of that rule. I think he's right. I certainly don't believe that the media needs breathing room under the First Amendment to rush out and adopt a social media mob attack on a 16-year-old child. The First Amendment does not require that to be a viable, effective protection to our citizens.
We had freedom of the press long before New York Times versus Sullivan, didn't we?
We did. Media seemed to do okay.
I mean, radio was developed, TV was developed, all forms of communication, national newspapers were developed. So the media, broadly speaking, really had a revolution in communications even prior to New York Times versus Sullivan. I would ask you this question. Are we better off where we basically have reporters who claim immunity from the law, where they can basically say anything, call people names, run with the reports, then do little retractions later, maybe, maybe not, and claim that's freedom of the press? Is that really a healthy way for a nation to communicate, people to people, group to group?
Look around you. Look at what's happened. Look at the deterioration in the media in the last several years, the last couple of decades. I've watched it since the Richard Jewell case. It's not unhealthy. It is horribly unhealthy. There's nothing valuable to our public discourse for people to just simply go out and tell rumors, lies, make accusations with no sources, to be able to use the media and the First Amendment to, in effect, advance his or her or some corporation's own agendas. That's what happened to Nicholas. There's a lot of agendas at work. The only person that didn't have an agenda was Nicholas Sandmann. He was on a high school field trip to the National Mall to participate in the Right to Life march. It's gotten to be a situation where it started off with when you got to the internet, Mark, and you had this new development where you could sit in the privacy of your home, and with a few strokes of a keyboard with anonymity, you could send out statements to the world that could ruin a reputation in seconds. And if you track that into how it's evolved to social media, where you have all of these people on Twitter and Facebook, and they're anonymous, and they deteriorate the level of discussion where now it's just gotten worse and worse and worse. And now the news media tracks it.
That's what I was
because
gonna ask
now
you.
you go look at most of your articles now, and you're going to see sources say, people close to. Nobody's identified. Used to be the media was very careful in using any type of confidential source. They had to have it back in the Woodward and Bernstein days. The Washington Post required 2 sources to verify any information attributed to Deep Throat. Well, those days are gone. Now the media has simply become like the internet users and the social media users, because they put out a lot of information without any attribution to real sources who are identified, who can be accountable for lies.
I want to ask you about your client, Nicholas Sandmann, in a moment. But first, I want to ask you still about this thing we call the media. CNN, ultimately, they're owned by, I think, Time Warner.
Maybe AT&T now.
Maybe AT&T now.
Big corporations.
NBC, MSNBC, Comcast?
Big corporation.
What kind of influence does that have on newsrooms?
Well, take a look at what type of coverage we get out of NBC and MSNBC and CNN. There's no objectivity. There's no fairness. It's just like they've become an extension of political parties out trying to influence the public instead of informing the public. You know, it used to be the standard was get it first, but get it right. They've thrown out get it right. And now I don't think they even worry about getting it first because they know they can't. I use the example that if you look back at what happened to Nicholas, you had the media all over President Trump. We got him. They had the BuzzFeed report that said the president had directly told Michael Cohen to lie to Congress about the Trump hotel in Russia. And then Friday night, Mueller comes out, says that story's inaccurate. It's not true. The media went to bed Friday night with two black eyes, and they woke up Saturday morning on the 19th of January, and they came out swinging again. This time they were swinging at a young boy because he was wearing a Make America Great Again cap, and they took him out and tried to punch him and beat him and attack him like a schoolyard bully. And the reason I make that point is because they did not bother to look into the allegations and the statements being made on social media. They just joined the social media mob. That's why I make the reference that the media has literally become an extension not only of political parties, but of the social media mob. And that's beyond the Wild Wild West. There's no real legal accountability yet. We don't know how to control from a legal perspective the type of conduct and the type of speech that we're seeing on the social media websites. But it needs to be done. There's going to have to be accountability, Mark. And if we don't get accountability, the deterioration is going to continue.
When we come back, I want to ask you about your client, Nicholas Sandmann. How's he doing? I want to ask you about your fight with the Washington Post, who, if anyone's next, what your plans are, what your arguments are, and what is the reaction of some of the targets or potential targets of your litigation. Ladies and gentlemen, don't forget, almost every weeknight you can watch me on Levin TV, Levin TV. Just go to blazetv.com/Mark, blazetv.com/Mark to sign up, or give us a call, 844-LEVIN-TV, 844-LEVIN-TV.